Mark Rockwell, Senior Editor Custom Content for Public Sector 360. I'll be your moderator today. This event is brought to you by GCN and sponsored by Rubric. As you know, ransomware attacks continued to grow steadily throughout 2021, not only costing governments billions to remediate, but also interrupting local critical services and networks. The relentless attacks have prompted the federal government to accelerate both defensive and educational efforts to stem the tide. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, part of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, is a valuable resource not just for federal agencies, but for state and local government organizations as well. Among the array of cybersecurity tools the agency offers to state and local governments is a dedicated ransomware help website that houses facts, tips, as well as self-assessment for vulnerabilities and other practical resources. In this webcast, GCN Editor-in-Chief Troy Schneider will explore the services CISA offers to guard against ransomware and other cyber threats, as well as steps forward-looking agencies are taking themselves to increase their cybersecurity resiliency. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, if you want to enlarge the slides, look for the square icon in the top right corner of the slide window. You can also review the presentation in full screen mode by clicking the squared arrows icon. If you have any technical difficulties during the session, look for the yellow question mark icon below the slide window. Click there for technical assistance. If you would like to download a copy of today's presentations, just look for the Resource Center just below the question field. Finally, within the next day or two, we'll email you a link to the archived version of the session so you can view it again or share it with a colleague. The on-demand version of the webcast will be available for 90 days after today. We're also offering CPE credits to those listening to the webcast. The details will be in a follow-up email. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Troy.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And as Mark said, we're going to talk about the ransomware and data management risks that state and local agencies are facing, and some of the resources available, in particular those that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency can offer to state and local organizations. But before we get into that, it's worth talking a little bit about the risk itself. And the stats that you see on the screen right now are from CISA and data points that they have gathered over the last couple of years. And you can see some of the dollar values of and the cost of these attacks. And that number in the bottom right, the 42% of public sector organizations having been hit with a ransomware attack in the last 12 months. That stat's a little bit older, but I don't think there's been any signs that the frequency has declined. State and local organizations in particular have been seen as attractive targets because they don't necessarily have the defenses that federal agencies might, but they do have the important citizen data and the pressure to get services back up and running, and therefore may be more open to paying the ransomware, or paying the ransom that the ransomware is demanding. And I want to sort of use one relatively recent case study as an example, which is the city of Lafayette, Colorado, which was hit by an attack that compromised their phone service, their email, their online payment reservation systems, and ultimately did pay a ransom. This is not the most recent attack, even the biggest, but I want to share it because the Lafayette officials did a very good job of explaining the problems they faced and how they went about addressing them. I think it's a good jumping off point for today's discussion.
Hi Lafayette, I'm Mayor Jamie Harkins, and I am here to bring you up to speed with an event that has disrupted city computing services. We want to be completely transparent with the activities to date and reassure the community that we are on a path to resolution and a more secure future. On Monday, July 27th, a ransomware cyber attack on the city's computer system resulted in disruptions to phone service, email, and online payment and reservation systems. 911 and emergency dispatch services were not affected. Immediately after the detection, all network connections were disabled to contain further spread of the malware. Mutual aid from neighboring jurisdictions, cybersecurity analysts and recovery specialists, and emergency management personnel were brought on site and are continuing to provide forensic investigation and recovery assistance. Ransomware is a type of malicious software used by criminals to encrypt data and block access to computer systems until a sum of money is paid to the hackers to receive a tool that then restores that data. Our preliminary investigation indicates the ransomware entered the city's system through either a phishing scam or brute force and looks to be a random attack. Financial data appears to be recoverable from unaffected backups. Personal credit card information was not compromised as the city uses PCI certified payment gateways. There is no evidence to suggest personal data was compromised, but out of an abundance of caution, residents and employees are advised to be vigilant and monitor accounts for any suspicious activity. The city will be sending a security breach notification to individuals who have personal information residing on the city's network. I can tell you that using taxpayer funds to pay a ransom was definitely not the direction the city wanted to take. We attempted to pursue any possible avenue to avoid paying the ransom. Staff worked to determine the severity of the attack while analyzing data and backups to find alternative solutions. After a thorough examination of the situation and cost scenarios, and considering the potential for lengthy, inconvenient service outages for residents, we determined that obtaining the decryption tool far outweighed the cost and time to rebuild data and systems. This past weekend, the city paid a ransom amount of $45,000 to the criminals holding our data hostage. We did not share public updates last week because the information would have resulted in a strategic disadvantage for the city when communicating with the ransomware party. Our city unfortunately encountered something that an increasing number of agencies are dealing with. We have struggled to manage the impacts but are now on a path forward due to quick response and the help of regional partners. Staff has begun the slow and arduous process to now restore encrypted data and backups and allow city business to return to normalcy as quickly as possible. We do not know at this time how long that process will take. While there is no way to eliminate the risk of these types of attacks, the city is taking steps to improve our technology protocols by installing crypto-safe backups, deploying additional cybersecurity devices, and implementing regular vulnerability assessments to prevent future data threats. While city staff works to restore our systems, temporary email and phone numbers have been established for residents to continue municipal business and can be found on the city's website. In all of this, know that we are here for our residents. We have many committed and dedicated staff who are and have been working around the clock. They are proud to work for the city and to provide their best for all who call Lafayette home. Thank you so much.
So, as you saw in that video, even after their sort of after-action analysis, they're still unsure of the entry point for the malware, and they took the right steps. They immediately disconnected their systems. They brought in outside support, and they've now moved to bring new defenses online that they hadn't done before. And even though federal agencies argue that ransomware should never be paid, the officials from Lafayette made the decision that this was the most expedient way for them to get their systems back up and online. And I use this example not sort of point fingers at Lafayette. I think they actually should be commended for the work that they did and the transparency that they offered, but just to kind of make real the risks that are out there. Now, in terms of what an organization can do to defend against ransomware attacks, to minimize the chance of them happening, and to make sure that they have the resiliency if an attacker does break through, one of the best practices, and all of these come from recommendations that CISA has made. At the 101 level, there are things like employee awareness and training programs. Better spam filters, even detonation chambers to make sure that that dangerous attachments don't get through and compromise systems. Better filtering for emails and guarding against executable files, and different sort of network IP management, and especially minimizing the use of privileged accounts, moving to sort of a least access privilege management approach, or or zero trust, to use one of the very sort of hot topics in government IT now, to make sure that even if an account is compromised, it can't go further across the system than is absolutely necessary for the job at hand. When you get to more advanced defenses, CISA recommends using DMARC for additional email security, and restricting the use of server message block protocols. And then backups, which we'll come back to later in this presentation, are essential. They stress the importance to not just have backups of the data, but to make sure there are original images of the applications themselves. And in extreme situations, even having backup hardware sort of ready, bare metal, to be used in case the other systems cannot be sufficiently cleaned and purged of the hardware. And there's a lot more that can be touched on in terms of the materials. And so one of the things that CISA did last summer was launch called StopRansomware.gov, which is intended as a one-stop shop of both self-service tools and educational materials for organizations, and also certain services that CISA officials can provide and support that they can bring to organizations. It's not tailored specifically to state and local governments. It's just one of the many audiences for this site, but it is a very critical audience and sector that CISA is focused on protecting. And so to dig into the resources that are available at stopransomware.gov and elsewhere from CISA, I spoke last week to Erin. Ms. Shepley is the Partnerships Branch Chief of CISA, and so she and her team are responsible for working with stakeholders outside the federal government. And she pointed out that that really includes organizations all over the world, and her overarching goal is to make sure that the work CISA is doing on behalf of federal government organizations pays dividends for those elsewhere, and very much including the state and local organizations. So I want to draw on our conversation and let you hear from Ms. Shepley directly. First of all, on why StopRansomware.gov was launched, and some of the resources that are available on that site. And so let's go to her for just a couple minutes of background information.
Part of the catalyst is how big of a problem this is. And year after year, we just continue to see the number of ransomware incidents increase. And it's affecting everybody from your average American up through, critical infrastructure organizations. So the catalyst, I believe, really is the imminent threat that ransomware continues to pose, and our interest in making sure that resources around understanding, mitigating, and recovering from ransomware are easily accessible to anybody and everybody, regardless of technical expertise.
Yeah, and I know there was a CISA presentation a year or two ago that talked about, I think the number was 42% of public sector organizations have been hit in the previous 12 months. Do you have any sense of what the attack numbers have looked like, or what the trends were in 2021 for ransomware in general and for government organizations in particular?
Sure. So some of the private sector reporting I've seen is interesting. However, one of the conversations that we always have is around how commonly ransomware is not reported. Part of it is people don't understand when or how to report. Part of it might be, perhaps even embarrassment that they were a victim of a crime. So I think, frankly, the numbers that we're seeing are way lower than what is in reality and what's impacting our nation.
Okay. And with the rollout of StopRansomware.gov, were there new resources spun up for that effort, or was this really more about organizing tools that were already in the toolbox?
It was a little of a combination of both. So there were already resources that we had put out over the years, best practices, guidance, and obviously if you're familiar with our organization, we always put out new products with respect to recent threat activity. So if, for example, a criminal threat actor has a lot of ransomware activity going on, we'll have a more recent product around that. But in conjunction with the release of the website, we also put out two things. There was a guide that was developed by the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is a grant-funded organization by CISA. And there is a quite comprehensive guide that was released around detection of ransomware, how you could become a victim of ransomware, basically the different vectors and best practices. Also, there was a ransomware readiness self-assessment. And so for my colleagues in the state, local, tribal, territorial arena, if they're familiar with some of our other assessment methodologies, it's very similar to the cyber assessment tools that we've done historically. So that tool also was rolled out in conjunction with the kickoff of the website.
So as you heard, there's a significant amount of educational materials there, but also certain self-assessment tools that that organizations can take advantage of. And the tools sort of focus in several areas of how to focus on patch management, on the known vulnerabilities, that education side, which is it can't be the whole solution, but is an absolutely essential cornerstone for ransomware protection. And then on the backups as well. And so we're going to go back to Ms. Shepley for a little more context on some of those tools and services.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the point about taking advantage of things to lower your risk, there's really three things I want to highlight. One is around patch management. So a large vector is always going to be unpatched, generally known vulnerabilities, and there's two great resources around that. One is just our cyber hygiene scanning tool. It's looking at your open keys internet IP space and is going to flag any vulnerabilities that remain unpatched on your network. The other one is actually more recently launched by our organization, and I just wanted to make sure I mentioned it here. It's the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog. So something that we've rolled out as part of a directive for the federal agencies is truly a benefit for everybody because we are publishing a catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities. In other words, these are vulnerabilities that we know that adversaries are using as a vector to gain access to your networks. Beyond that, obviously backups is a key, and user awareness training. So CISA also has a lot of great resources around user awareness, whether it's basic packaging of, the cyber essentials, the guidance document that I mentioned before from the MSISAC, but also just general user awareness training that can be rolled out so people can understand what is ransomware going to look like when it pops up on my computer, so to speak.
Okay, great. And what about direct support? Where is there? I mean, is there any way that that CISA sort of actively gets involved with the state, local governments, before an incident takes place? I'll stop there. Is there, are there sort of the equivalent of penetration testing or the election systems assessments that were going on for general ransomware readiness that state and local organizations can draw on?
So I would say beyond the ransomware readiness review, which is really going to be like an organizational self-assessment to understand, like, if you were a victim, what protections do you have in place or what processes do you have in the place to recover? Something that perhaps happens behind the scenes is obviously ransomware is global in nature. So we have excellent relationships with international partners, for instance, because when some of these ransomware crews begin a campaign, it's not just targeted at the United States, it's global in nature. So we're often rapidly sharing information and insight if there's any sort of staging activity that we see a ransomware crew doing, and particularly if we have any insights as to what the potential targets would be, we're going to reach out to those entities and let them know. So we do a lot of that sort of rapid sharing, and we're obviously always looking to kind of explore different ways that we could maybe block and tackle. We also partner with the FBI, which obviously has a huge role in this space and from a law enforcement perspective.
Okay, great. And then what about right of boom? When a ransomware attack has happened, obviously there are things organizations do themselves, but are there, I guess, two versions of this question. Are there resources that are that CISA or other federal agencies make available, and are there things that you would encourage them to reach out to CISA about?
Sure. So part of the guide that was published talks about recovery from an incident, and there are things that organizations should have in place regardless of ransomware, just from a cybersecurity standpoint, like a incident response plan, continuity of operations and continuity of government planning, or even something as seems simple, but media relations in response to something like this. So there's a lot of great guidance documents that are part of the StopRansomware.gov website, but also organizations could look at longer term planning and talk to us about cyber exercises. Mm-hmm. So how do we plan for and responsibly recover from an incident like ransomware or another incident from a malicious?
So I want to go back to a couple points that she mentioned there in that last segment. One is CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. This is a relatively new offering. It's available to anyone who accesses the CISA.gov website, and you can see the URL here on this slide. This is, as she mentioned, is an important resource of the vulnerabilities that they know bad actors are utilizing, that organizations need to prioritize when it comes to fixing on their systems. It's downloadable in a couple different formats. They're machine readable, so that hopefully this can start to be pulled in an automated fashion into into an agency's systems. And there is the ability to subscribe for updates, as well as to submit other possible vulnerabilities to CISA for assessment there. As it currently stands, there are about 312, 315 vulnerabilities in the catalog, and something that they're constantly reviewing and updating. So it is an important tool for agencies trying to understand what the threats are out there. And then I also wanted to, for just a moment, about the importance of backups, which, as Ms. Shepley said, are absolutely essential. And we could do an entire presentation on the ins and outs of backups, but here I just want to hit on a couple of the high-level considerations. One is that the 3-2-1 model, the traditional standard for backups, is a good starting point, but not sufficient. And I think most of those who are paying attention to this webcast know what 3-2-1 stands for, but it is to have at least 3 copies of your data, to make sure that they're on at least 2 different storage systems, and to make sure that at least one of those backups is stored off-site and sufficiently, not just air-gapped, but geographically removed in case of other disasters that might occur. And again, that's an important starting point. What constitutes off-site is a little bit different in the cloud era than it may have been when organizations were doing disaster recovery plans 10 or 15 years ago. But it's also about making sure to have those gold images of systems that I mentioned before. And it's especially important to make sure that those backups are immutable, because what is increasingly happening with ransomware attacks is the bad actors are not only infecting the systems, they're sort of lying in wait and looking for ways to compromise the backups, or to go and encrypt backups that were made before the ransomware struck. And so making sure that an organization's backups are immutable and then accessible on an enterprise-wide level is key. And so what immutable means that once the data is written, it can't be rewritten, can't be modified, deleted, or even read by clients on the network. It can only be appended with new records that are copied over. All that data is fingerprinted at the time of ingest, so that if someone were able to touch those records in any way, it would be obvious from the timestamps and the other tracking data that are on them, and that backup data is never exposed directly to external clients. It can only be cloned and have those clones shared back to the necessary locations on the network, and even then, only through very limited privileges that are not being used for other day-to-day operations. And then finally, it needs to be managed in a unified, enterprise-wide way. The old approach of doing backups on a kind of a scripting system-by-system or database-by-database basis is just not practical with the complexity of systems now. If you want a reasonable time to recovery after any sort of mishap, you need clear visibility into which data sets may have been compromised, how recently they were updated, and how to bring them back. And that really does need a system-wide approach. And so with that, I want to return to Ms. Shepley and some of the other resources are out there. StopRansomware.gov was intended as a clearinghouse and a good starting point to have as much information as CISA could provide, but it is not the only resource available to state and local governments from the federal government by any means. And so here, Ms. Shepley and I talk about some of the other resources are out there from the MS-ISAC, which got mentioned briefly earlier, and a couple other sources that organizations can turn to.
So if folks aren't familiar with the structure, we have ISACs, or Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, across just about every critical infrastructure sector and beyond that. And the MS-ISAC serves a critical component of state and local, tribal, territorial cybersecurity. They have a 24/7 security operations center. They have basic network sensors deployed across many of the states and local entities. So they have amazing visibility as to malicious activity targeting and impacting state and local governments. They obviously generate products based off that visibility, and they're an amazing resource, right? They have technical expertise. You can get on the phone with them. They're a great friendly face to call, and will provide you, the technical advice and guidance, and also can look across the rest of the ecosystem and understand what's happening, and if this is part of a larger campaign that we need to warn the rest of the state and local government community about.
Very good. And and along that same vein of knowing who to talk to before you need to talk to them, are there other organizations that you would encourage state and local governments to be reaching out to, or other resources that might not be directly on stopransomware.gov that they should be looking to?
Absolutely. I need to mention also MS-ISAC is free. I should have mentioned that before, so that's a critical component of that. CISA organizationally has a huge regional force. So chances are there is a cybersecurity advisor somewhere in your backyard, maybe 5 miles away, maybe 50 miles away, but they're a great resource locally. They'll have an amazing network of local resources, things that I won't even know. Maybe there's a regional working group, there's a coalition of the willing, if you will. They'll also be able to point you in the direction of your local law enforcement, whether that's just state and local law enforcement that might be have specialty in this area, but also local FBI resources that would be important. The only other thing I want to mention on top of that are the state and local tribal territorial associations. So a lot of those, like NASCIO or U.S. Conference of Mayors or National Association of Counties, have amazing resources as well that give a lot of great guidance around cybersecurity issues tailored for that.
when I said beyond stopransomware.gov, that doesn't necessarily mean beyond CISA. As Ms. Shepley touched on, one of the important resources are the regional CISA employees and offices, and wanted to where one finds those local contacts. If you go to CISA.gov/CISA regions, you'll see a bigger version of this map and ways to link in and connect to the local team members. And as Ms. Shepley said, it's an important thing to do before the crisis hits. And so would encourage you to make those contacts if you haven't already. And MS ISAC is another very important tool that will share a link to that organization here in just a moment. But as she mentioned, that is it is a free service to all state and local governments. Has lots of expertise that can be drawn on both before, during, and after a ransomware attack. I also wanted to take just a moment to sort of come back to that privilege access question. And at the federal government level, there's a strong push right now towards zero trust security architectures. And really that means least privilege access and making sure that one doesn't have administrative privileges unnecessarily, one doesn't have access to data or systems that are not necessary for that person, and more importantly, for the particular task at hand. And so what makes Zero Trust different is the sort of constant monitoring and trying to make sure that privileges are being adjusted and managed and restricted based on the activities on a day-to-day and even minute-by-minute basis, not simply a user's identity and credentials, because one doesn't need to have the same level of access to all systems at all times. It's a much more complicated effort, but it's something that the federal government is moving toward. State and local organizations should be thinking about how to bring zero trust architecture to their systems in the coming months and years. And we're not going to spend much time on it here today, but in the sort of additional resources that are available, wanted to call your attention to a recorded presentation from the Federal Chief Information Officer, Chris DeRusha, did with our sibling publication, FCW, a couple months ago, talking about the importance of zero trust and how federal agencies are moving toward it. It's about 20 minutes and well worth your time. The other links here, of course, are for stopransomware.gov, for the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and then something we didn't talk about in this presentation, but is worth revisiting, which is the ransomware resources that are available from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which has great materials, again, for all sectors, not just government, not just state and local, but a treasure trove of important information for those that are trying to improve their security posture. And with that, Mark, I think I will hand it back to you and see if we have a couple questions or a few minutes to discuss them.
Yeah, I think a couple questions here. Thanks, Troy. I was wondering, a lot of state and local governments are not. They may or may not be comfortable discussing this stuff with CISA, and don't really have an established relationship. What are some of the first steps they can take to set that relationship up ahead of an attack? You mentioned a little bit of it with the local.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something Ms. Shepley touched on. I'm not sure we included that part of the interview, but just not waiting until an incident happens. Reaching out to both the local CISA representatives and to MS ISAC and some of the other organizations that were mentioned now, and to to start to understand what the resources are that are available, what the best practices are. It's a chance to run through some of the questions of, do you have the proper plans in place? And a lot easier to talk about these things when it is in sort of planning and almost sort of wargaming mode, as opposed to responding to the crisis in the moment. So there is it's also a chance to be able to understand what information might need to be shared down the road, and determine comfort level, again, before it's a crisis moment. So, I don't think that the answer there is really that much more complicated than just, make the connection now before the need is really acute.
There's the Log4j stuff is on everybody's mind too. How do you see that changing the landscape? I know that's probably above your pay grade, but how is that going to affect ransomware, do you think?
Well, it is another example of the vulnerabilities that are in the in the IT code supply chain, and so that new catalog of known vulnerabilities is an important thing, because that's not going to be the last of these to be discovered. So it is. I don't know that particular vulnerability brings specific ransomware risks as opposed to just general security risks. And at a certain level, ransomware is just an attack with a different payload. Good cyber hygiene, good patch management will protect against lots of different attacks, and it's just it's what they do once in that distinguishes ransomware. So I think the main thing is that there's a reminder of how important it is to stay on top of the patch management and be plugged into the lines of communication, because not all of these vulnerabilities get the type of news coverage that one has.
Interesting. You talked about patch coverage there for a minute. I was wondering about how do you see this trying to defend against ransomware improving cybersecurity overall? I mean, there's a lot of basic building blocks involved with both. Do they feed on one another?
They absolutely do. And I had a conversation with a couple of federal officials not too long ago about this question, where federal agencies refuse to pay ransoms. So to the degree that ransomware organizations are being deliberate in who they attack, there's kind of a limited return from federal agencies. But there's still the importance of guarding against it and focusing on it, because the steps being taken are essential to good cyber defenses across the board. If you're defending against ransomware, you're also defending against data exfiltration. You're also defending against malicious destruction of data whether by criminal organizations or by other nation-state hackers. It is, ransomware brings extra challenges because of the public nature of it, because of the difficulty to be able to keep critical government services running. But the defenses, with very few exceptions, are not unique to ransomware. They're the same steps that organizations need to be taking to guard their systems from all sorts of hostile actors, and frankly from Murphy's Law and natural disasters as well. Good prevention, good data backups will guard against a lot of old-fashioned, non-malicious problems as well.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're up against the time limit, and I wanted to thank Troy for his time today and for the informative presentation. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mark.